Also, if you believe in an all-knowing God, then free will is impossible. It's contradictory.
1,000 years of deep-thinking philosophers would disagree with you.
Yeah, at least like the last 50 years of philosophers would disagree with you. Causally inevitable means determined.
No, it doesn't.
Absolutely, yes, it does.
Well, have it your way.
Let's look at how Jordan Peterson should have answered this atheist on the subject of free will. For those that haven't seen it, Jordan Peterson was recently on a debate that was originally entitled 1 Christian versus 20 Atheists. They have since changed it because during the debate, Jordan Peterson awkwardly said that he wasn't a Christian. Here's how he answered a question of belief on God.
You're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either you're a Christian or you're not.
I won't talk to you if you're a smartass.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
Now, I actually am appreciative that he said this because whilst I like his practical stuff, we do, as Christians, accept his non-acceptance. He is not a Christian. We'd like him to become one, but it's good to finally get some clarity. Now, sadly, the debate did not go well from a Christian perspective because Jordan Peterson doesn't actually really understand Christian belief very well, and he became combative, he became flustered. And that is in comparison actually to the large majority of the atheists that were questioning him, who, other than one guy who was rather abrasive,
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing.
they were rather calm and had more thoughtful arguments than a lot of atheists that have come before. It seems that there are a new generation, or there is a new generation of atheists coming who maybe don't have the bluster of Dawkins and Harris and actually do have some good questions. And I want to actually address one of those questions on the topic of free will. I thought from the atheist perspective, he had a good interaction. Peterson, as he did many times throughout this debate, did appallingly poorly, but someone who's more acquainted with Augustine, Boethius, Calvin, the Westminster Confession, and so on, would be able to answer. Also, someone acquainted with the Bible also would be able to answer. That's helpful too in all of this. So let's listen to the full thing. It's a couple of minutes, and then we'll give some responses.
Also, if you believe in an all-knowing God, then free will is impossible because
Wait
if
a sec. Wait, let's not go to that
because
yet.
you threw free will into the mix.
Well, that was the answer to your question.
Yeah, and
you
I'm
said,
saying
why
that's
wouldn't God...
incoherent.
Well, you know,
It's
1,000
contradictory.
years of deep-thinking philosophers would disagree with you,
Yeah,
but have it
and
your way.
1,000 years of, or at least like the last 50 years of philosophers would disagree with you. These analytic philosophers, people like Graham Oppie make arguments about the incompatibility of omniscience and free will, that if God created this world, if he chose this world instead of that world, then he makes it causally inevitable every single action that you were going to make. If he made a world where we were just electrons in love, then none of this would have happened. But by making us in this world, knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future, it makes all of those events inevitable, which means that they're all causally determined, which means that we have no free will if you believe in an all-good God, or an all-knowing God that made everything.
Well, have it your way.
Okay, cool.
I don't-
So then the
I
free will
don't-
of the Odyssey fails.
Well, it fails for you. That doesn't mean you've disproved it. I mean,
Do you want to
tried
respond
to
to
make
the argument?
Yes, you tried to make a case for a causally deterministic universe. I don't think there's any evidence for that at all.
Do you think that God could have created a different universe than the one that he created?
I have no idea.
Okay, so then there's going to be a double bind, right? So either he couldn't have done it, in which case he lacks a power, or he could have done it, in which case we don't have free will, because he chose this world instead of that world, making the events of this world instead of that world inevitable with his infallible knowledge.
I don't understand where you're headed.
Well, it just means that the free will defense fails. Like all this, under
Like
your
I said,
view,
if
under
you want
your
to have
view,
it
free
fail,
will.
no problem. I don't know why it's relevant to the issue we're
Do you
discussing.
acknowledge that under your view, free will doesn't exist?
No.
Oh, then do you want to respond to the argument?
You'll have to phrase it more
Sure,
clearly
okay.
so that someone like me can understand it.
Yeah, gotcha. So God already knows in advance everything that's going to happen, which means that by making this world instead of that world, everything is inevitable, which means that God's act of causing this world instead of that
Inevitable
world,
doesn't mean determined.
it's causally inevitable if God chooses this world instead of that world.
Doesn't make it determined.
Causally inevitable means determined.
No, it doesn't.
Absolutely, yes, it does.
Well, have it your way.
Okay.
That's not the case.
You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
For anyone who got lost in that, here is the argument simply stated. The atheist argues that if God knows everything, we cannot by definition be free, because since God knows what we're going to do before we do it and chose to create this world with those actions, our choices are locked in, they're inevitable, which means that we don't have real free will, we just have the illusion of it, because God's knowledge and plan determine everything we do. And a practical analogy would be this: if you have the author of a play it's not an author of what is a playwright. That's what it is. Shakespeare was a playwright, not an author. Anyway, he writes characters, and that determines all that they do, and all of their choices are actually set in advance by someone else. So that is the position that's being outlined by this atheist here. Let's give the Christian response, and we'll do it in 3 simple parts. So response 1 is that God is outside of time. I've got my trusty paper here, and we'll use that to explain a little bit about what we're talking about when we say that God predetermines something. So we often imagine, and I'll cut this, but give me some time to draw. We often imagine that when God predetermines, it looks like this. So this is how we often view the idea of God predetermining. Here's a timeline of all of human history. You are here at some point, and you know literally just this bit. This is the bit that you're aware of, so you know your past reasonably well. You don't know the future actually at all. And what we imagine is that God, the creation of the universe, well, he is here. Prior to that, he's here, and he knew all of this. He was looking forward, and he knew all of what was to come, right? And he caused it in some way. And Calvinists and Arminians actually agree on this in some way. For those that know what that is, don't worry about it if you don't. And he either knew it, caused it, determined it, permitted it. But he causes this to happen in some way by setting this universe into being, right? By creating this universe. Now, the problem is that this understanding of God is not quite right, because it assumes a God who is time-bound. It imagines God who exists at some point on this timeline, or on a timeline. Maybe it goes on before the creation of the universe, but it's a timeline, right? And he's moving along with us and experiencing it in some way like we are. That is not the case, right? Here is the actual case. Again, my multimedia presentations are always incredible. So here's where God actually is. My editing work is incredible, as you can tell. So we've assumed that he's here, but he's not here, right? I've deleted this, so you can't see it at all, right? God is, in fact, here. He is above the timeline. He is outside the timeline, and it is something that he views from a completely different perspective to us. So nerd out with me just a little bit, right? Let's read a quote from Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. I'm sure you all know it anyway. You've all read it, right? Anyway, here's what he says, which is very helpful. He says, "Since God lives in the eternal present, his knowledge transcends all movement of time and abides in the simplicity of its immediate present. It encompasses the infinite sweep of past and future and regards all things in its simple comprehension as if they were now taking place. Thus, if you will think about the foreknowledge by which God distinguishes all things, you will rightly consider it not to be a foreknowledge of future events, but knowledge of a never-changing present. For this reason, divine knowledge is called providence rather than prevision, because it resides above all inferior things and looks out on all things from their summit." John Calvin, another one who talked about this, said something very similar. I'll try and give a condensed quote, but he says, "When we attribute prescience," that's foreknowledge, "to God, we mean that all things always were and ever continue under his eye, that to his knowledge there is no past or future, but all things are present, and indeed so present that it is not merely the idea of them that is before them, but that he truly sees and contemplates them as actually under his immediate inspection." So back to our timeline here, right? Now, I know this is complex and very hard for us to grasp fully, but it does make a serious and substantive change to how we view these things. Because when we think about things like foreknow and predetermine, we use those terms, right? And they're biblical terms. But I think they should be viewed more as what we might call anthropomorphisms, right? Where God speaks at a level that helps us understand, but that is a simplification of what it is actually like. This, by the way, helps answer the question on free will versus predestination and all of that. This is actually the Reformed answer in that. But it's the idea that for God to know something is not for him to know something before it happens, right? Because there is no before in God. For God to know is the same thing as for God to decree, is the same thing as for God to respond. All of these things are happening in perfect present. Let me give you a helpful analogy that might simplify that a little bit. Let's say you're going for ice cream. Ice cream! And like any good, decent human being, you're getting mint chocolate chip because that's the correct one. And let's say I know before you get your mint chocolate chip ice cream that that's what you're going to do. So I know it in advance. But then I also see you ordering the mint chocolate chip and I know that you are having it. I'm watching you eat it. And then after the fact, the next day, I know that you did have mint chocolate chip. God's knowledge is like all three of those things at once. And that is how he views everything all the time. So when the atheist says, if God knows that I will do something, it's got to happen and therefore I'm not free, they are imagining that God's knowledge is like this script that we talked about that forces you to act. But the truth is more complicated than that. God's knowledge doesn't happen before your choices as he views it, as we view it, it might be, but as he views it, it's not. He knows it eternally. That is not to know it from way, way, way long ago. It is to know it from outside of time. So when we use these terms, we often use them as we would use of ourselves, to know something in advance, but we are forgetting God's timeless nature. So that is why God is able to foreknow and predestine in a way that, because it's outside time, includes our freedom rather than cancelling it. That's point one. Okay, now point two is this. Free will needs to be correctly defined, and the correct definition is doing what you desire. The atheist in this kind of says, doesn't say it exactly, but here's a paraphrase. He says that if God knows everything, then you're not free because your choices are locked in. But that misunderstands free will. The atheist is making the assumption that if you're going to be free, you have to be completely free, what someone might call libertarian free will. But here's the problem with that. That kind of freedom is actually impossible. Again, let me give another analogy. I love football, right? I'm actually sitting in my garage. There's football right here. I'll get a football. This is a football, Americans. This is football that you play with your feet, okay? Unlike your version, which you play with your hands.
Oh, I get it.
I love this game. Right, now why do I love it? Well, I grew up watching games. I grew up playing with my friends. I may also even just be wired to like that. I also grew up in the late 20th century and early 21st century at a time when football was popular and in a part of the world, unlike America, where that's one of the primary sports that are played. And I also had enough time to do so, right? So my choices, they are shaped by a whole bunch of things. They're shaped by my desires, shaped by where I live, shaped by my DNA, when I live, right? If I grew up in the 21st, not in 21st century Belfast rather, if I grew up in the 15th century in Aztec society, I'd probably not play football, right? I'd probably kick around the severed heads of my enemies instead. I have one of those around here too. Actually, no, I don't. Severe lack of severed heads around here. Anyway, that means that my choices and my choice to go and kick this ball, well, they are not completely free. But does that mean that it's not a free choice, right? It's one way, there's one way in which it's not free, but I still, if I go out and kick this ball, well, I am making a free will choice. It's not libertarian freedom, it's the freedom of someone who is finite, but it is still freedom. And so when we talk about freedom, we are free in a way that is free in our nature, but not free from our nature. We are free in who we are to do the things that we desire to do, but we are not free from who we are, which, by the way, not even God is free from his nature. We see in the Bible, it says, God, it's impossible for God to lie, God cannot sin, etc. Why is that the case? Well, because it is his nature. But this kind of freedom, the freedom to do what you desire, that still means that you're responsible, right? So if you're in a courtroom, let's say you've committed murder, right? To supply me with severed heads for my game. And you tell the judge, well, look, the only reason I did this ultimately is because I wanted to. I'm a murderer at heart, and there's not much I can do about that desire. That doesn't get you off the hook, right? That's not an excuse. You are still responsible. Now, some Calvinists are very scared of using the term free will, but John Calvin himself wasn't. And actually, I don't think we should be as Christians, because in order to be human, part of being made in the image of God, is being able to follow our desires in a way that is unopposed. Calvin himself said, in this way, then, man is said to have free will, not because he has a free choice of good and evil, but because he acts voluntarily and not by compulsion. So the fact is that this atheist idea of freedom, where it must be completely free from nature, is an impossibility. Our choices are free, not because they are free from nature, but they are free in our nature. Our choices are free because they are ours, shaped by our desires. The fact that God's eternal plan includes them does not diminish that freedom at all. Right, now here's point 3. Very quickly before I do that, I want to let you know about the Wilberforce Academy that is happening from the 31st of August. It's a 1-week residential for Christians aged between 18 and 35 happening in London, helping people get a biblical worldview on things like media, politics, culture, etc. If you would like to sign up for that, please check out the website, which is wilberforcecollective.org. Link is below. If it's after the application deadline, just tell them that you saw it on my channel and they will get back to you. Point 3 is that the double bind fails. Let's tackle that. So the atheist says, either God couldn't make a different world, so he's weak, or he chose this world, in which case your choices aren't free. And a lot of Christians hear that and get scared. Zoink, Scoob, how am I going to answer that? But it is a false dilemma. So let's work through it nice and slowly here, and we'll unpack why that double bind fails. So firstly, yes, of course, God is powerful enough to make any world that is logically possible, right? But he cannot make a world in which your choices are free from your nature. As we said, not even God himself is that free. As C.S. Lewis said, nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God. God does not do nonsense, so he has to choose a world in which we make real choices that are bound by our nature, because that is how choices are made by beings. If you have a being, your nature defines your choices, right? And he also has to perfectly know what those choices are, because that is his nature, right? The other options are to not make man in his image, so to make robots, which he doesn't actually want, where there is no freedom of will. No, there is a freedom of will that exists. Or he would have to make beings without natures, where those choices become completely unrestrained. But that is, once again, nonsense. That is not a thing. You cannot have a being without a nature. Furthermore, when God chooses to make that world, he has to know what those choices are and what they will be and what they were all at once. He is outside of time. He cannot change who he is. He simply cannot do other than that, or he would cease to be God. Now, none of that means that we don't do what we desire. The double bind assumes that such a freedom from nature is possible, which it isn't. And it also assumes that God could somehow exist in a time-bound manner, which he cannot, right? The atheist is demanding, in order to be free, that God should make us in a way that we are not human, or he should cease to be God. It is a nonsense proposition that falls apart. And the Westminster Confession says this very well. It says, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatever comes to pass. Yet so, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. So I agree, there is some mystery to all of this, right? The timeless God, kind of beyond our full comprehension. I don't know what it means to be timeless, right? Never experienced that in my life. Don't know that I ever will. Don't know that we get timelessness even in the new earth. I think we're time-bound beings. But nonetheless, the double bind doesn't actually hold together. God's timeless nature means that his knowledge doesn't force our choices, but it does include them. Our freedom is real, even with the limits of our desires and circumstances. We still do what we desire to do, and God's eternal plan uses those choices for his glorious purpose. The atheist, on the other hand, demands that man not be man and God not be God, and that, quite simply, is foolishness. If you were predestined to like that video, but you also liked it of your own free will, then you can free willingly, but also in a predestined fashion, smash the like button or press it in a normal fashion, really whatever you prefer. We're going to open up smashing the like button on this, but really any form of pressing it will suffice. You can also support the channel through wearecontramundum.com, or you can go to Patreon and support there. And the algorithm actually is probably predestined what you're going to watch next. So it's going to suggest another video here, and we're going to pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that you are beyond our understanding and that your will is good and will be established in the world. Help us to choose to follow you by your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.